So here I have underlined two phrases. The first we need to look at is free and independent. So we can see right here that the United States and the other allies intend to separate Korea from Japan and ensure that it becomes an independent nation again. However, the other phrase I have underlined here, in due course. So it doesn't, they aren't saying that Korea will become immediately free and independent after the war ends, but at some point in the future. And this statement actually caused quite a bit of anger amongst Korean independence activists who we talked about last week are active in Manchuria, in China, creating their own armies to fight the Japanese. So this was not a very welcome statement. In fact, despite free and independent in due course causing some anger. And then at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, right, so only a few months before the end of World War II, Roosevelt, in a conversation with Joseph Stalin, says that he had in mind for Korean trusteeship composed of Soviet and American and Chinese representatives. In the Philippines, it had taken about 50 years for the people to be prepared for self-government. He felt that in the case of Korea, the period might be from 20 to 30 years. So you can see in Roosevelt's statement here, this very, there's no other way to really put it, this very racist perception of the Koreans as well as the Filipino people not being capable of self-government, needing some sort of tutelage of the United States and other civilized Western powers, in this case, the United States and Soviet Union, and that it might take up to 20 or 30 years for the people of Korea to be prepared by the Americans and by the Soviets to govern themselves. So when we think about why the United States wanted to enact trusteeship over Korea, this perception by Americans of Korean people as incapable, of not ready for their own self-rule was definitely a strong rationalization for the United States. If you look at U.S. documents during the colonial era, they are definitely influenced by the Japanese arguments that Koreans need this sort of strong hand guiding them because they are not ready to rule themselves. And there's also a bit of problems caused by people like Lee Seung-man and these different factions in the United States. They're lobbying for the United States to help them help Korea re-obtain its independence, but they are often conflicted with each other, squabbling amongst themselves, and this gives the American policymakers a very negative impression of Korean elites. There's also concerns about what will happen to Korea economically after it is separated from Japan, right? So Korea had been a colony of Japan for, by the time the war ended, some 35 years. So what is going to happen when Korea is ripped away from its colonial overlord? Because, right, the Korea's economic situation had been mainly geared towards sending raw materials and other things to Japan to be inputs into the capitalist economic market over there. And then Japan was providing many finished goods to Korea. So once this relationship ends, will Korea be able to stand on its own 2 feet economically was a concern that pushed the United States towards trusteeship. And then also, of course, envisioning the coming Korean War, the United States, as did the Soviet Union, wanted to establish a pro-American or pro-Soviet government on Korea, which would entail, having Americans present on the peninsula to ensure that this did in fact happen. So as we know now that the 38th parallel became the line that divided North Korea and South Korea after the war. And after the Korean War ended, right, we get the demilitarized zone that was formed roughly somewhere close to the 38th parallel. We'll look at a map later, but the line kind of goes diagonal. So some places that were under South Korean control before the war end up being under North Korean control after this peninsula here in particular. And then some areas over here, particularly on the East Coast, that were under North Korean control before the war ended up under South Korean control. In any case, as the war is drawing to an end, the United States and Soviet Union have this loose agreement that trusteeship will take place, but there was no agreement in place yet, actually, where the different occupation zones would be. And so on the eve of the end of the war, the United States threw 2 officers into a room. These officers would actually go on to become important figures in U.S. foreign policy going forward. In any case, they looked at a map, decided that the 38th parallel divided the peninsula roughly in half, while importantly keeping Seoul, the capital, in the southern half for the Americans. And the United States suggested this line to the Soviet Union, and they agreed without any sort of counter proposal or anything. So this became the line that divided the peninsula. Was a very hasty and last minute decision. So now what I want to do is go into each occupation zone. We'll start with the Americans in the south, and then we'll go to the Soviets in the north to see what each side was doing in their half of the peninsula. And to make a long story short, as I mentioned before, both sides are going to be supporting groups that they view as friendly to themselves, while trying to ensure that this post-trusteeship united Korea, right? At this point, we don't see that they have designs to make the division permanent, that this united Korea will be friendly to the US or friendly to the Soviet Union. So August 15th, 1945, very important day in Korean history, right? This is the day of liberation from Japanese rule, when the Japanese signed their unconditional surrender to the United States and other allies, ending the Pacific War. Of course, the Japanese colonial officials in Korea knew that this was coming, and they had also heard many stories of how Soviet troops were being very brutal in Europe. They were beginning to witness this for themselves as the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan just weeks before the end of World War II. And they knew that these communist forces would be much less hospitable to the Japanese after surrender than the United States would be. So to try and forestall this Soviet occupation of Korea, the Japanese government begins to ask Korean people to set up some sort of administration for themselves, hoping to forestall the Soviet occupation. And they approach a man named Yeon-hyung to set up this organization, and he agrees to do so. And at this time, he founds the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence on Liberation Day. This body ends up instructing these local people's committees that sprout up as the war is ending to take over administration, local administration from the departing Japanese colonial officials. And each of these people's committees throughout the country send representatives to Seoul. And what they do is they proclaim the Korean People's Republic on September 6th, 1945. So we can see that despite this coming trusteeship, that the Korean people themselves were very active in trying to reassert their independence and wanted to found a government right after the war ended. However, the United States and Soviet Union had already agreed on trusteeship. And so when the US forces arrived in Korea, and it took them almost a month to get into Korean territory after the war officially ended because they didn't have any troops in the neighborhood. So a group of US forces who were on Okinawa, I believe, were told to sail up to Korea and didn't land until September 8th, 1945. And this US forces who were landed on Korea and set up the US military government were led by a man named General John Hodge. But when John Hodge arrives in Korea, he refuses to meet members of this Korean People's Republic. And later on in December, he actually outlaws this body, signifying the end of this attempt, this first Korean attempt to establish a unified independent government. Once the U.S. military forces arrive, they begin, and of course, I mentioned the word people's committees, right? These Korean people are setting up people's committees. If you're an American with this aversion to communism, and people's committees would have sounded something to Americans that suspiciously sounded like a communist movement. They wanted to make sure that communist forces do not get a foothold in Korea. So when the U.S. military lands in Korea, they begin to make relationships with people who are anti-communist. And these anti-communist forces in Korea are the landed elite. Many of them had been Japanese collaborators, right, working with the Japanese colonial authorities. And these landed elites set up a political party called the Korean Democratic Party, but it's very unpopular amongst the public because many of these people who form the KDP are seen as having collaborated with the Japanese, and they don't want these Japanese collaborators being the people who come to rule a united Korea. But nevertheless, to the Americans, these landed elites, these Japanese collaborators, were anti-communist. Many of them were also very good English speakers. They had been educated abroad and learned to speak English. They were very educated. They were very well-to-do. These would have been people that American military officers felt comfortable interacting with. And so they give these people in the KDP a very prestigious positions in advising the military government. In October 1945, the U.S. military government forms an advisory council and invites these members of the KDP to participate. And Yoon-hyung, the man who was responsible for setting up this Korean People's Republic, was the only moderate or leftist invited to this body, and he outright refuses to participate in this advisory council because he doesn't want to be associated with all of these Japanese collaborators. So we can see how the stench of collaborating with Japanese is covering these rightist forces, which is going to make it very difficult for the United States government to found a group or found an independent Korean state that is friendly to its interests, recognizing that these rightist forces who would be pro-American have this stench of Japanese collaboration on them. What the United States does then is to start to bring back Korean independence fighters from abroad who are also anti-communist. And there are two important figures here. The first is Syngman Rhee, who of course would go on to become the Republic of Korea's first president. He had been in the United States during the almost the entire colonial era. He was very anti-communist, and the U.S. government arranged for him to return to Korea after the war ended. And then Kim Gu was another figure. He had been in China for most of the colonial era. We talked about him last week, engaging in some activities, assassinations, and whatnot, also trying to set up an army to fight the Japanese. He was brought back to Korea from China in November. So these very anti-Japanese fighters, they have a well-known reputation in Korea as being very anti-Japanese, but at the same time, they are they're anti-communist plus they're anti-Japanese, the people that the United States needs to help them form an independent government in Korea that is both friendly to the United States, but also can be accepted by the Korean people. As we get into the end of 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union had agreed during the war to enact trusteeship, but they didn't have an exact roadmap for how trusteeship would work. So to come to terms with one another about how this trusteeship thing would work, the two sides met in Moscow in December 1945 to establish what the parameters of trusteeship would be. How would they go about establishing an independent Korean government? And what they agreed to do at this time is to establish a joint Soviet-American commission that would together create an independent Korean government over a period of 5 years. And this agreement was made in December, and then in December 1945, the news reaches Korea about this Moscow conference and the trusteeship agreement between the two superpowers. And there are, at this point, large protests against trusteeship. Why? I don't think it's hard to understand. The Korean people had just suffered through 35 years of Japanese colonial rule. They believed themselves capable of self-rule. They had, thousands of years of self-government, the Joseon dynasty, Goryeo dynasty, going back a long time. They didn't feel like they had any need for, a big brother in Washington or a big brother in Moscow. They wanted these occupying powers to leave and to govern themselves. And an important thing happens at this time that's going to become key in the following discussion is that the conservative forces in South Korea in particular continue to organize protests, very public protests, very large-scale protests against trusteeship. whereas the communists in North Korea, under the direction of the Soviet Union, do not protest the Moscow Conference result. They do not protest trusteeship, even though, of course, these Korean communists don't agree with it necessarily, but they decide to go along with the Soviet Union in what would become a strategy for supporting a communist-led government in Korea, and they do not protest the Moscow Conference result. So now let's transition to what is happening in North Korea and what the Soviet Union is doing up there. The Soviet Union, just as the United States did, believed that it had national interest at stake on the Korean Peninsula. We saw last week how Russia, of course, this wasn't the Soviet Union, right? This is Tsarist Russia. In any case, Russia had gone to war with Japan over the Korean Peninsula, right? Both wanted to ensure their interests in North Korea or on the Korean Peninsula. At this point, still, the Soviet Union is interested in these so-called warm water ports on the Korean Peninsula, right? The Russian Far East ports in that area freeze over in the winter, making it very difficult to have shipping going in and out on the Pacific side of the Soviet Union. So maintaining a presence in Korea is something that's very important to the Soviet Union. They also recognized that there were some critical resources that they could receive from the Korean Peninsula. One of these critical resources was actually electric power. During the colonial era, the Japanese had tried to begin an industrialization process on the Korean Peninsula and had built many hydroelectric power plants, particularly in North Korea. And with the Soviet Union occupying that, they believed that this was could be very useful, not only to, of course, the Korean Peninsula, by diverting some of that electrical power to the Russian Far East. There was also many factories that the Japanese had built in North Korea. So these were very important resources for the Soviet Union, and they did not want to give those up. And we can also see in Soviet policy papers that the Soviet Union had ideas about pushing for its own interests in Southern Korea as well by although they never actually officially demanded such things, they had the idea of perhaps arguing that the Soviet Union should also be given control of important locations, ports in particular in Incheon, Busan, and also on Jeju Island. So although the Soviet Union did not directly try to occupy the entire Korean Peninsula, which it possibly could have, as I mentioned, the U.S. forces didn't arrive in Korea until almost a month after the war ended, whereas the Soviet Union had entered Northern Korea before the war or the Japanese surrender was actually signed. So if the Soviet Union had wanted to, they could have fairly easily occupied the entire Korean Peninsula. But during World War II, right, the Soviet Union and the United States are allies. So Joseph Stalin decides to observe his agreement with President Roosevelt and not occupy the entire Korean Peninsula, despite perhaps an ability to do so. As the Soviets move in, they eventually decide to support a man named Kim Il-sung, who of course would go on to become a very important person in Korea. Kim Il-sung we'll talk about a little bit later. And we can see through Soviet documents now that just as the United States was doing in trying to form a government that would be friendly to itself, the Soviet Union was doing the exact same thing. In early 1946, the Soviet Union was already preparing a government in North Korea, writing a constitution for Korea, and training Korean communists on Soviet-style administration. So both superpowers were very active in trying to set up a government favorable to themselves. And then when we get to this trusteeship, implementation of the trusteeship, let me skip forward a little bit here. In March 1946, so we have the Moscow Conference in December 1945. So this joint Soviet-US Commission meets for the first time in March 1946. And what the Soviet Union does at this time, which was very a well thought out strategy, I guess you could say, is that the Soviet Union demands that only groups who agree with the trusteeship process be allowed to participate in the Korean Democratic Provisional Government, which was to be set up by the Joint Commission So what this does is, with all the conservative, rightist, pro-U.S. forces in South Korea publicly protesting against trusteeship, and the communist forces in North Korea under the guidance of the Soviet Union not protesting trusteeship, this demand by the Soviet Union that only groups who support trusteeship being allowed to participate in the founding of this provisional government, this makes it likely that this provisional government will be very slanted to the left, right? And the United States, it has a hard time arguing against this, right? If you have groups that disagree with an entire process, how can you bring them in and make them a part of it? This is a very, logically difficult argument to refute. So what the United States has to do in a few months later, in May 1946, is to declare its intention to delay the commission in an effort to go back into South Korea and try to persuade pro-U.S. groups, these conservative rightist groups, to participate in the trusteeship process. And so over the course of 1946 and early 1947, the U.S. tries to work with not only conservatives, but maybe some more moderate or slightly leftist groups to help them work together in this Korean Democratic Provisional Government to set up an independent Korean government that would be not explicitly pro-Soviet Union, that might be in the middle or eventually pro-US. But this becomes incredibly difficult as conservative forces continue to reject participating. An important thing that happens at this time is Yoon-hyung, who I mentioned at the very beginning, who was kind of a moderating figure, one kind of Korean political leader who could talk with both figures on the right and the left. He is assassinated, and it makes it very difficult for the U.S. to envision this joint commission process ever resulting in a government that would be pro-U.S. So what the U.S. decides to do is to push for the permanent division of the Korean Peninsula by submitting the Korea issue to the United Nations in the fall of 1947. Why does the U.S. decide to take the issue to the United Nations? If we think about what the United Nations was right after its foundation at the end of World War II, it was a very pro-U.S. body. There are very few independent communist countries at this time. If we think about, for example, the Security Council, we have the United States, United Kingdom, France, of course, are very close allies with one another. We have the Soviet Union on the other side. But at this time, China, right? China is controlled by the nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek. So it's 4-1 in the Security Council. If we look at the General Assembly, most of the states that are in the General Assembly at this time are also pro-US. So the United States feels like it can get what it wants to achieve in Korea done through the United Nations rather than negotiating one-on-one with the Soviet Union. So in November 1947, the United Nations, through the General Assembly, forms the United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea, which is founded to supervise free and open elections, assist with the withdrawal of occupying forces, and guide the new political entity into full independence. So this is basically doing away with the Moscow Agreement of 1945 and instead putting the Korea issue, right, the formation of an independent Korean government, giving that task to the United Nations. And of course, the Soviet Union does not want to cooperate with this. It wants to ensure that the Korean Peninsula has a pro-Soviet government. So when the elections are held, mandated by the United Nations on May 10th, 1948, these elections only take place in South Korea, and the Soviet Union and North Korean communists refuse to allow UN election supervisors to enter that part of the country. So this May 10th election in South Korea forms a constitutional assembly, which then drafts the constitution of the Republic of Korea. And in July 1948, Lee Seung-man is elected the first president of South Korea. Importantly, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the first presidential election in South Korea was not a direct presidential election. He was elected by members of the National Assembly only. And in any case, on August 15th, right, this very symbolic day for liberation, the Republic of Korea is proclaimed. In South Korea. A week later, elections in North Korea happened for the Supreme People's Assembly, and on September 9th, 1948, we get the establishment of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And so this is how we get two Koreas. So to kind of wrap up here a little bit, how did we get the division of the Korean Peninsula, these racist perceptions of Koreans by Americans, and a desire to ensure friendly government emerged on the Korean Peninsula, not only by the US, but by the Soviet Union as well, led to this idea of trusteeship and division. And then this division became permanent when both the United States and Soviet Union were unwilling to allow a government to emerge on the Korean Peninsula that would not be friendly to one or the other sides. And so rather than taking an all or nothing attitude towards the Korean Peninsula, both sides sought to divide it into half. And another key aspect of this that I haven't gotten into too much, but that we have to keep in mind is that the idea of division was also acceptable to some Korean leaders. They recognized that if they tried to go for a united Korean independent government, that they had the possibility of losing out on taking power. So establishing a rightist conservative government in South Korea ensured that somebody like Lee Seung-man would definitely come to power. Establishing a communist government in North Korea for Kim Il-sung would mean that he would definitely be able to come to power. So these Korean leaders were willing to work with the outside powers to achieve their goals and facilitate the division of the peninsula. Okay, so that's how we get the divided Korean Peninsula. And now we'll get a little bit into why the Korean War started, right? So we have these two different Koreas, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have to go to war with one another, right? So in the historiography of the Korean War, the reasons that historians attribute to the outbreak of the Korean War have changed over time. The orthodox position in the United States or in South Korea was that the war started because the Soviet Union wanted to expand its territory. So this orthodox position put the responsibility for the war's outbreak on the Soviet Union. The revisionist position, which came about in the 1970s and 80s, and this man here, Bruce Cummings, was a major figure in putting forth this revised history of the Korean War, attributed the outbreak of the Korean War to a sort of civil war this is much more focused on the Koreans' role in the outbreak of the Korean War, but it was a war of leftists and Korean independence fighters in North Korea versus Japanese collaborators and rightists in South Korea. And Bruce Cummings also made, at the time, this very controversial argument, which has since become to be proven false. In any case, Bruce Cummings argued that perhaps the United States and South Korea tricked North Korea into invading because they wanted to fight a war, but they did not want to be seen as the instigators of that war. However, after the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, Soviet Union archives were opened up and historians could go into the Soviet archives and begin to understand more about what had happened in North Korea before the outbreak of the war. And historians were able to find very clear proof that the Korean War was actually an initiative of Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung was the one who wanted to begin the Korean War, and he went to Stalin and later Mao Zedong and asked for their support of the invasion of South Korea. And eventually Stalin and Kim Il-sung did give that approval. Why did they give that approval? Initially, Stalin had refused to support the outbreak of the Korean War in 1949. Excuse me. However, in January 1950, Kim Il-sung went to Moscow, and this time Stalin gave his approval. So why? What had happened where in 1949 Stalin had denied support for the war, but in 1950 decided to support it? There were some very important developments in late 1949 that led Stalin to change his mind. The first was the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Korea in the spring and summer of 1949. Some historians argue that if the U.S. had not withdrawn its troops from Korea at this time, that the war would not have started, and is perhaps one of the major reasons why we still have U.S. troops in South Korea today, right? This perception that U.S. presence maintains the peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. The second important development was the Soviet Union's successful nuclear weapons test on August 29th, 1949. Right prior to this, the United States had a monopoly on nuclear weapons and could use them at will, knowing that no other country could retaliate with nuclear weapons against the United States. But once the Soviet Union gets nuclear weapons, now the U.S. has to be much more hesitant about using nuclear weapons in a wartime scenario. And then the third important reason for Stalin changing his mind was the victory of the Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War. So the People's Republic of China was officially proclaimed on October 1st, 1949, right? Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist forces were forced to retreat to Taiwan, where the Republic of China, right, still exists to this day. And importantly, the victory in the Chinese Civil War allowed thousands of Korean troops, communist Korean troops, to return to North Korea. They had been assisting the Chinese Communist Party in its war in China, but now with this war over, these combat-hardened North Korean troops could go back to Korea, and now they were available for an invasion of South Korea. And this was also a very important factor in the outbreak of the war. So why did the Korean War start? The invasion that began on June 25th, 1950 was definitely a premeditated attack by North Korea, carried out with the support of both Stalin and Mao Zedong in China. The Soviet war was very active in providing assistance with planning the war, with logistical support, with weapons and ammunition. And so there's, it's very irrefutable at this point that it was a North Korean plan, and it was premeditated. It was not, we still have some debate about who fired first, because in 1949 and 1950, there were a lot of small skirmishes between South Korean and North Korean forces along the 38th parallel. So it's indeed entirely possible that the first shot was fired by South Korean forces. But the reaction, even if it was South Korea who shot first, the reaction of North Korea to go for a full-scale invasion was definitely something that was premeditated and planned months beforehand. I'm not sure I really have enough time to go through this, but I'll do my best to go real quickly. And if you want to ask more questions about this at any time, I'm happy to answer them. So how did the Korean War play out? I'm sure many of you know this already. In the first stage of the war, North Korea's invasion pushed South Korean forces back very quickly into a small little bubble around Busan in the southeast corner of the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. intervened immediately and sent forces from Japan to Korea to help halt the North Korean advance, and created what is called the Busan perimeter around the city of Busan. And then the United States counterattacked by the amphibious landing at Incheon, which is right next to Seoul over here. And this cut North Korean supply lines in half, led to the capture of many North Korean forces down in South Korea. And then the United States and South Korea made this fated decision to cross the 38th parallel to try to unite the Korean Peninsula via force. And U.S. and South Korean forces penetrated deeply into North Korea. However, what this did was give a pretext to China to intervene in the war on North Korea's side. So in November 1950, the Chinese forces enter in force, cross the Yalu River into North Korea, and push the U.S. and South Korean forces back down to the peninsula. Seoul is captured by the communist forces for a second time. The U.S. and South Korean forces are able to halt this advance about at this point, and then push the communist forces back north to a line about where today's DMZ is. And so from the summer of 1951, only about a year after the war started, until 2 years later, the line of fighting stabilized about right here. So a question is, why did the war last 3 years, right? The major ups and downs on the Korean Peninsula have been completed after about a year of fighting, but the war didn't end for another 2 years. The main problem here was the armistice agreement negotiations were dragged out for 2 years, which resulted in immense destruction. During this entire 2 years, the United States continued to bomb North Korea mercilessly. Thousands of Korean and Chinese and American and other forces that were helping South Korea were losing people. In any case, these armistice negotiations happened at Panmunjom, right? This is a very symbolic place in inter-Korean relations where these little blue houses are erected. You've probably seen lots of pictures of them. Here's Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un meeting several years ago. Donald Trump also famously went here and stepped over the line as a symbolic first U.S. president to put a foot into North Korea. So why did these armistice discussions last so long? I won't get into everything here, but the most important issue was the POW issue. POWs meaning prisoners of war. So right over the course of the war, many North Korean and Chinese soldiers were captured by the U.S. and South Korea, and U.S. and South Korean forces were captured by North Korea and China. So after the war ended, how were you going to return the POWs to their rightful side? Tradition in war, and according to international law, POWs should have been repatriated to the side they were fighting for as soon as the war ended. However, the U.S. came up with this idea to insist on voluntary repatriation. What this means was that the POWs, the prisoners of war, would be given the choice. Do you want to return to the side you were fighting for, or do you want to stay on the side that had captured you? So, for example, if a North Korean soldier was captured by South Korea, the POW would be given the choice. Do you want to go back to North Korea, or do you want to stay in South Korea? This was a very controversial issue. The reason for it being controversial is that the communist sides knew that they had, the North Koreans had forcibly conscripted Koreans living in South Korea into the North Korean army after its initial invasion in the summer of 1950. The Chinese side had forced thousands of troops that had fought for the nationalist side in the Chinese Civil War to fight in the Korean War, which was quite embarrassing because the Chinese army that fought in Korea was called the voluntary army, right? This Chinese voluntary army. So they were ostensibly Chinese people, communists who had volunteered to go fight in Korea, but many of them were not volunteers. They were forced to go. So if POWs were allowed to choose where they would go after the war, the communist side knew that many of these POWs who were supposed to return to the communist side would stay on the South Korean or Taiwanese side. And this was a very embarrassing propaganda victory, but eventually the Chinese and Koreans agreed to go ahead with voluntary repatriation. And we can see among the total of POWs who elected to go through voluntary repatriation, so 14,700 Chinese POWs said they wanted to go through this voluntary repatriation system, and almost all of them decided to stay on the UN or US South Korea side. The same with the North Koreans. So this is very embarrassing, right? These soldiers were supposed to be fighting for the communist side. They were supposed to want to return to this communist utopia, but they decided to stay on the enemy side. And an interesting footnote in history, there were several Americans who decided to go through this voluntary repatriation thing, and some 21 Americans decided to stay on the communist side. And there's actually a picture of them. These are American soldiers who were captured by North Korea during the war, and through, I guess you could say, political indoctrination during their time in prisoner of war camps in North Korea, they began to see North Korean communism as a good thing, and they decided to stay in North Korea. Actually, they were moved to China after the war ended. So kind of an interesting footnote in history there. In any case, that's all I have prepared for the division of the Korean Peninsula and the Korean War. If anybody has any questions about these topics, please feel free to ask them now. If not, I will move into discussing very briefly post-war North Korean history. So any questions about the division of Korea or the Korean War? I'm not seeing anything, so I guess I'll go ahead.
Nadine, I cannot seem to see the okay, now I can see the what's this, the computer with our students. So is there anyone in class who would like to ask a question to Dr. Engel? I do not see any show of hands at the moment. So maybe if we could continue.
Yep, we'll keep going then. Okay. So what I want to get into next is a very brief talk about post-war North Korean history. And I'll briefly talk about who Kim Il-sung is, or was, I guess, because he is a colossal figure in North Korean history, right? He is the first of this, what many people call a dynasty, the Kim dynasty, right, in North Korea, with his grandson, Kim Jong-un, of course, being the leader now, and his son, Kim Jong-il, being his successor. So when we think about North Korea, of course, today, two things that come to mind are nuclear weapons, missiles, also maybe starvation and economic deprivation. But if you look at post-war North Korean history, this wasn't the fate that North Korea necessarily had to go through, and it was definitely a conscious decision by North Korean leaders to emphasize military spending over developing the economy. There's also very disastrous decisions in terms of how to manage the economy that are made by North Korean leaders that lead to the poverty and, of course, the great famine of the 1990s. And many people today are worried that a situation similar is happening in North Korea right now. Right, North Korea imposed kind of isolation upon itself during the pandemic. So how did North Korea get to this state that we know it as being in today? So Kim Il-sung was born in 1912. He's born in the Japanese Empire, right? Japan had already annexed Korea by the time that Kim Il-sung is born. He was born into a modest family, not aristocrat or anything like that. So he completed some limited schooling when in Korea, and his family moved to China, as many Korean families did at that time, due to the difficulties of the colonial era. And he completed some schooling there, but Kim Il-sung was not in any sense an intellectual or a scholar. He was not a great communist thinker. What he did during his formative years, for the most part, was participate in guerrilla activities fighting the Japanese in Manchuria, in the Soviet Far East. As the Japanese moved into Manchuria in the 1930s and set up, right, that kind of puppet state of Manchukuo, Kim Il-sung and guerrilla fighters like him were forced to flee into the Soviet Union. At that time, his guerrilla unit was subsumed under the Soviet Red Army. So Kim Il-sung was actually, a member of the Soviet Union's army during this time. And he spent most of the 1930s and early 1940s living in these very unhospitable regions in Manchuria and the Russian Far East, freezing cold, starving conditions, very difficult. And that's actually where his son, Kim Jong-il, was born. Today, the North Korean Kim dynasty has this kind of fairy tale about the Kims descending from Baekdu-san, or Baekdu Mountain, which sits on the border between North Korea and China. But Kim Il-sung was actually born in the Soviet Union. Kim Jong-il, excuse me, was born in the Soviet Union. During World War II, Kim Il-sung actually saw very limited fighting against the Japanese because the Soviet Union hadn't declared war against Japan, right? For most of the World War II, the Soviet Union and Japanese were not at war with one another because the Soviet Union did not want to be fighting a two-front war, right? The Soviet Union for most of World War II was dealing with this massive Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union and repelling that, and then pushing into Europe to destroy Hitler and the Nazi government in Germany. However, throughout the war, Stalin had been promising President Roosevelt of the United States that once Nazi Germany was defeated, that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan to aid the United States. And eventually he did keep that promise and entered the war. But Kim Il-sung was not actually involved in these initial, this kind of very short burst of fighting between the Soviet Union and Japan. After the Soviet Union occupied North Korea, Kim Il-sung was belatedly brought into the Korean Peninsula along with many of his Manchurian guerrilla fighters by the Soviet army to serve as translators and, people to help the Soviet army deal with its new occupation of Korea, right? So they needed people to be kind of liaisons between Korean society and the Red Army. And Kim Il-sung was one of these people that was brought in to help with this. Initially in North Korea, the most recognizable Korean independence fighter was a man named Jo Man-sik, who was an ardent anti-Japanese independence figure. However, Jo Man-sik was also a Christian. If you know anything about communism, you know that Christianity and communism don't tend to get along with one another. Jo Man-sik was not only a Christian, but very nationalistic, and he didn't want to collaborate with the Soviet occupiers. So Jo Man-sik was pushed aside, and the Soviet Union decided to install Kim Il-sung as kind of their man in Pyongyang to be the face of Soviet occupation, thinking that he would be somebody that they could control very easily, right? He had been in the Soviet army, they could talk with him, and they felt like because he was young, he didn't have his own power base, he would be somebody that they could easily control. But the Soviet Union turned out to be very wrong about their ability to control Kim Il-sung, and we'll talk about that. However, at this early stage in North Korea, Kim Il-sung, although he has the backing of the Soviet Union, is only one amongst many factions of communists in North Korea vying for power. And there are actually four different factions. The first are the Manchurian guerrillas. This is Kim Il-sung's faction. These Manchurian guerrillas were Koreans who had been fighting in Manchuria and the Russian Far East all throughout the 1930s and 40s. And amongst them, Kim Il-sung has some prestige. But because they were in Manchuria, because they were in the Soviet Union, nobody in Korea knows about these people. Right? The Japanese-controlled media is not going to report on the great successes of these Manchurian guerrillas, right? That would be undermining the Japanese colonial government. So North Koreans or Koreans anywhere had not really heard of Kim Il-sung. They had no idea basically who he was. So he did not have any sort of popular power base in Korea when he returned. Another important faction was the Yan'an or Chinese group. These are communists who had fought alongside the Chinese Communist Party during the Chinese Civil War before World War II, who had fought with the Chinese communists against Japan after the Japanese invasion. And then many also fought with the Chinese communists during the Chinese Civil War after World War II ended. And these people had the, of course, backing of the Chinese Communist power and Mao Zedong. Another important and probably the most powerful faction in terms of people, just pure number of people, were the domestic communists. These are Korean communists who stayed on the Korean Peninsula throughout the colonial era and tried to organize communist agitation against the Japanese colonial government. And then the final group are Soviet Koreans, Koreans who went to the Soviet Union during the Japanese colonial era They were trained by the Soviet Union in Soviet-style bureaucracy. So the Soviet Koreans also did not have a very strong power base, but they were very close to the Soviet Union because they had, years and years of experience working with the Soviet army and Soviet government. So what Kim Il-sung does throughout the 1950s is to slowly remove these factions as a competition to his power. And the first faction that has to go is the domestic communists, because they are the most formidable. And the most well-known domestic communist was undoubtedly a man named Park Hon-young. He was well-known in Korea, South Korea, and the entire Korean peninsula under Japanese colonial era. After liberation, Park Hon-young stayed in South Korea actually to try and organize the Communist Party in South Korea. However, as the United States military government was repressing communist activity in South Korea, they actually put out an arrest warrant for Park Hon-young, and he was forced to flee into North Korea. And he became the Minister of Foreign Affairs under this initial North Korean government that was established in 1948. And he was a key figure who helped plan the North Korean invasion of South Korea in 1950. When Kim Il-sung went to Moscow to meet with Stalin in 1950, Park Hon-young went with him. That's how prominent he was. However, Park Hon-young's undoing came with a poorly thought out plan on his part. One of the things that Park Hon-young argued is that if North Korea invades South Korea, then these repressed South Korean workers and peasants would rise up against the pro-Japanese government in South Korea and would help North Korea to win this invasion by having this massive swelling of bottom-up, grassroots support for the North Korean invasion. However, this did not materialize. There was no great revolution amongst South Korean people against their leaders after the Korean War started. And so Park Hon-young was alleged, accused by Kim Il-sung as having, drastically overestimated the support that they were going to get. And then during the course of the Korean War, there were plans that were uncovered by pro-Kim Il-sung loyalists that this domestic communist faction was orchestrating a coup against Kim Il-sung. And these conspirators were arrested. Most of them were executed. Park Hon-young was also arrested at this time, but he wasn't executed until many years later. In any case, this was the undoing of the domestic communists. And then later in 1956, I don't have much time, so I won't get into the details. There was another kind of attempt by the remaining two factions, the Yan'an group and the Soviet Koreans, to challenge Kim Il-sung's leadership. This was done based on the de-Stalinization process that was pushing forward in the Soviet Union after Stalin's death. So Stalin died in 1953. And then in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, who was Stalin's successor, gave this important speech called the Secret Speech, denouncing Stalin's dictatorship and a cult of personality. These two other factions in North Korea, based on this de-Stalinization process that was happening in the Soviet Union, criticized Kim Il-sung as being like Stalin. And so this was their move to try to remove Stalin from power. However, after the domestic communists had been removed, Kim Il-sung had taken this, used this situation of a kind of vacuum in government posts to appoint his own loyalists, right? These people from the Manchurian guerrilla faction into these important posts in government. And they were able to defeat this challenge by these two other factions. And essentially in 1956, any opposition to Kim Il-sung's rule is removed. The only faction remaining standing is all those people loyal to Kim Il-sung. And in a sense, we've never really had another major attempt by, at least that we know of, any group to challenge the leadership of the Kim family ever since. So what were the factors important in Kim Il-sung's rise? How do we get this Kim dynasty? Undoubtedly, Soviet support is one of the main factors here. Kim Il-sung would never have become the leader of North Korea if the Soviet Union hadn't appointed him to this important post. in 1945. Replacing Joe Manchik with Kim Il-sung was an incredibly important event that helped Kim Il-sung rise to power. Ironically, the division of Korea is also very important for Kim Il-sung rising to power because Seoul, the capital, was in the south. And most of the prominent leaders, communist or not, were vying for power in South Korea. And so this reduced Kim Il-sung's competition. If, for example, somebody like Park Hon-young had immediately gone to North Korea after liberation and become close with the Soviet Union, maybe he would have been more likely to rise to power. But because Park Hon-young stayed for a couple of years in South Korea, this made it, there was no strong competition for Kim Il-sung in North Korea because of the division. Help from other factions. The Yan'an group was actually very instrumental in helping to remove the domestic communists. So Kim Il-sung was very adept at playing this factional game in the 1950s. Another very important aspect of Kim Il-sung's rise was that him and his faction were put in control of the military immediately. So they had this monopoly on violence if they needed it to remove the other factions. And then the Korean War was actually another very favorable development, actually, by being able to lay the blame for North Korea's failed invasion at Park Hon-young's feet, right? This wasn't Kim Il-sung's misdeed. He didn't do anything wrong. Park Hon-young promised this uprising of Korean workers and peasants to the communist cause, and it didn't happen. So this is Park Hon-young's mistake, and we should blame him for our failed invasion. So real quickly, I want to talk about some developments in North Korea in the mid and late 20th century that helped give us the North Korea that we know today, and then we will take a break. I know I'm going really fast through all this, so again, please, if you have any questions, feel free to write them down. So 4 things that I would like to talk about regarding North Korea during this period. The cult of personality, right? We know North Korea as, pushing its leaders up into this almost position of being deities within North Korea. So cult of personality, the regimented society, right? So North Korean society is very tightly controlled. How does that system work? Economic development and the stagnation of the economic development in North Korea. And then finally, the Byungjin policy, which means the rise of favoring the military in North Korea. So cult of personality. What is a cult of personality? It essentially just means the elevation of one person above all others, and that person who is elevated takes on this sort of sacred connotation in a society. Beforehand, cult of personalities we know are something that has happened in communist countries in particular. Stalin, of course, created a cult of personality around himself, and Mao Zedong did the same in China. So if we want to think about sacred, right, we have Mao Zedong is in this image as being like the sun, right, shining down on the Chinese people below. So Mao Zedong in this is almost like a god, right? So what are the characteristics of personality cults? They're directed at the masses, at the entire population, right? Everybody has to buy into this. Mass media is a very important way to disseminate the cult. All these propaganda posters, songs, musicals, later on movies, all these different, in Mao's case, like his little red book, right? All these sayings. So everything is framed around this person's position in the society. Another important feature that is quite important is that the societies need to be closed, right? The more society is open to other sources of information, the more difficult it becomes to build a cult of personality, because people have additional information to challenge what they're being told about this supposedly great leader. Cults of personality are also secular. Even though this person is portrayed as sort of a deity, there can't be another religion to challenge them, right? So there can't be a Jesus or a Buddha to challenge the supposed divine nature of this leader. So they are secular. And then they're also typically very patricentric, meaning that power in society is skewed towards men, and then thus the personality must represent this. So why did Kim Il-sung decide to build a cult of personality around himself? Kim Il-sung, because of, he grew up, so to say, in Stalinist Soviet Union, right? He was a officer in the Red Army while Stalin was in power. So this is what he was taught, right? He saw Stalin doing this for the Soviet Union. So when he came to power in North Korea, he naturally decided to begin implementing the same policies that he had been taught during his time in Stalinist Soviet Union. So not only the cult of personality, but we also see the influence of Stalinism on his economic policies as well. The Soviets also, because they began influencing North Korea during the Stalinist era, the Soviet army, during their occupation of North Korea, also already began helping Kim Il-sung to build this cult of personality prior to the Korean War. So this process of building the cult of personality was actually helped to be put in motion by the Soviet Union, and Kim Il-sung was just continuing on with that. And it was also very helpful in consolidating his power, right? If we think about those early years, he is competing with these other factions for power in North Korea. So not only these power games at the top amongst the factions themselves, but the cult of personality helps Kim Il-sung to build his power base within North Korea, right? Because as I mentioned before, he doesn't have that power base amongst the North Korean society because he was this unknown figure coming in from the outside. So the cult of personality helps to fill up this vacuum at the bottom and give himself support. However, at the same time, North Korea's cult of personality is very unique. What's unique about it is that it's not only the leader, right, Kim Il-sung, but the cult of personality has expanded to include his entire family. So we have this picture here of Kim Il-sung with Kim Jong-il, his son, Kim Il-sung's mother, and Kim Jong-il's mother are also, if you go into the mythology of the Kim family, are very important figures in this. And so the extension of the cult of personality to the family is a very unique aspect of the cult of personality in North Korea. Now I want to go into talking about the regimentation of North Korean society, and I'm going to try to pick up the pace here a little bit. One important aspect of North Korea's regimented society is the so-called Seongbun system, which divides North Korean society into three classes. The core, or 핵심 in Korean, at the top, and these are the most loyal people to Kim Il-sung. The wavering class, or 동료, in the middle, and then the hostile, or 적대, at the bottom. And this is not only a way of dividing, loyalists to the regime, but depending on what class you're in, you also get certain benefits, or, if you're on the bottom, you are treated very harshly. So those people in the 핵심 class reside in Pyongyang, or have very well-to-do residences in other major cities in North Korea, whereas the people on the bottom of the pyramid are in the most unhospitable regions of North Korea. They have the hardest jobs, like mining. So these classes also determine your lot in life, so to say. And another important part about this is that this system is hereditary. So if you are born into the hostile class, there's very little chance that you will ever be able to get out of that position in your life. So this is a very feudal way of organizing society, with it not only determining your lot in life, but your children will also be treated the same way that you are. Another important system that North Korea put in place is the Inminban system. This is a way of organizing North Korean society into various groups. So in each Inminban, there's about 20 to 50 families, and each Inminban has an Inminbanjang, which is, the head of this group. And interestingly, the Inminbanjang is usually a middle-aged woman. The reason for this being that once a North Korean woman gets married, she no longer has to have a official workplace, so they have more time to take on positions such as this. And every North Korean citizen belongs to an Inminban. And part of it is to function as a sort of bureaucracy. It oversees, various neighborhood functions like removing trash, making sure everything's clean. But the more important function of it is surveillance, right? So the Inminbanjang, the person in charge of each group, records the movements of people. So if one of the people in their group leaves the area, they make a record. If somebody from outside comes into the area, they make a record. So they control the movement of people throughout North Korea. And also the Inminbanjang cooperates with the police to conduct random searches of people's houses. So they check for illegal materials. In North Korea, TVs and radios are very tightly controlled so that they can't access outside signals. So the police check on people's radios to make sure they're not tuning into broadcasts from South Korea or something. So this is a very important way for North Korea to maintain its control over society. Real briefly, just to go through economic development in North Korea. After the Korean War ended, North Korea was just completely destroyed. The American Air Force had just bombed the crap out of North Korea. There's no other way to put it. There were very few buildings left standing in North Korea. There's recollections by U.S. Air Force pilots that once they when they were given bombing targets, sometimes they would go there and there was nothing there. So they would just find any building to start dropping their bombs on top of to get rid of their payload. So there was just essentially nothing left in North Korea after the war. And so the Soviet Union and other Eastern European communist countries provided a lot of aid to North Korea after the war ended. Various countries would help in different ways. For example, East Germany sent a group of engineers to help rebuild important factories in a city called Hungnam on the east coast of North Korea. And this is a picture of East German engineers in North Korea after the war. And the Chinese troops who had fought alongside North Koreans during the war, many of them stayed in North Korea to act as laborers to help in the rebuilding process. During the 1960s, North Korea was actually developing at quite a rapid pace. And if you look at, compare North Korea with South Korea, actually in the 1950s and 60s, North Korea was growing faster. And one of the reasons for this were these so-called mass movements, where the North Korean government mobilized workers to achieve just kind of incredible production goals. This was very ideologically driven. So workers were inspired to work for, achieving this communist utopia. And it was quite successful initially. It led to rapid growth in North Korea, but of course it was difficult to maintain these movements without any incentives, right? So North Koreans in the communist system, they are supplied with most things through the public distribution system. So if I work 120 hours a week, I'm going to get the same amount of food as I get if I work 60 hours a week, right? So without any incentives, what are you going to do? For a while, you might be inspired by ideology to work for 120 hours a week, but eventually you're going to get sick of it, right? That's just not something that you can maintain for your entire life. So this began to break down. On the agriculture side, Kim Il-sung, following Stalin's example, organized North Korean farms aggressively into collective farms by the end of the 1950s. North Korea began to rely very heavily on machines for farming and a lot of fertilizer for farming. Because North Korea, if you look at it on a map, is a very mountainous region. There isn't a lot of arable land. So North Korean farms needed a lot of extra inputs to be able to produce the amount of rice and other crops to feed its population. in the early 1990s, right, with the breakdown of the Cold War system, Soviet Union is dissolved and Russia takes its place. And the amount of Soviet aid being supplied to North Korea in terms of energy was very important cause of the famine of the 1990s. North Korean farmers were not able to run their machines, their tractors, etc., the irrigation pumps for their farms. The factories that produce fertilizer weren't able to operate because they didn't have enough energy to operate. And this created the conditions that led to the 1990s famine. Just overall, this is a graph here showing South Korean economic development in blue and North Korean economic in red. We can see that since 1970, North Korea has not developed at all. You can see the slight downturn in the 1990s after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and that led to the famine. So what caused this? As I mentioned before, these mass mobilization efforts were just unsustainable. The decreasing aid from the Soviet Union was also very important in the agricultural downturn. There was also a lot of waste on these large-scale political projects, right? So the cult of personality, building these statues throughout the country, producing these materials to exalt Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un. This costs money, right? This costs money. People have to put time into this. So that was taking away resources. And then also what I want to talk about now was building the military at the expense of developing the economy. And this came from the so-called Byungjin policy. Byungjin, if you translate it, literally means parallel advance. And what that meant for North Korea was that there would be parallel development of the military and economy. And this policy was first announced in 1962 and included 4 lines. So the 4 things that the North Korean government was going to try to achieve was in arming the entire population, giving guns to everybody, intensifying military training, turning the entire country into a fortress, and providing modern weapons to its military. So to achieve this, the North Korean government aggressively increased spending on the military. So in 1959, as the country's trying to rebuild after the Korean War, only about 3.7% of the North Korean government budget is going into military spending. But between 1967 and 1972, around 30% of the government budget is going into the military. So if you're putting this amount of money into the military, that's money that's not going to economic development, right? And so this is a major factor in North Korea's economic stagnation. And of course, as we saw before there, one important goal was developing modern weapons for the North Korean military. And eventually this came to mean building nuclear weapons, building missiles to deliver those nuclear weapons. And that's where we get to the point where we are today with this legacy of, nuclear weapons, delivery systems to send those nuclear weapons to not only South Korea, right, but it was always an important goal of the North Korean government to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles to deliver nuclear weapons to the United States as well. And at a certain point, North Korea had to go all into this idea of North Korea being faced with these hostile forces in South Korea and the United States. And the only way that it could argue to its people that it was providing for them was to hype up the threat, the outside threats, and to argue that developing nuclear weapons and missiles was the only way to protect North Korea's sovereignty. And so that the North Korean people would just have to accept this, threat and make it their own missions to contribute to developing the North Korean military, as the North Korean state could no longer, in any way say that they were delivering, economic goods. They were not making the lives of the North Korean people better, but they were contributing to saving the North Korean people from these outside threats that wanted to colonize them again, as the Japanese had done beforehand. So I've kind of covered a lot in the first hour and a half here. I'm happy to take any questions that you guys might have. Looks like we do have a question here.
Yes, I think we have one. With the robust economic development of South Korea has been, what should the Philippines do to catch up, to be at par with the economic development happening in South Korea? Do we still have that hope to prosper like in South Korea? This is one question from an anonymous participant.
Yeah, that's a real good question. Well, here it is. I don't know. This didn't work last time. I'll throw the book up there. I don't know if anybody's heard of this book, Crony Capitalism by David Kang. He's a professor at the University of Southern California. If you're interested in this question about comparing South Korean economic development with the Philippines, that might be a good place to start. What many people point to when comparing the two is, and I'm by no means an expert on Filipino politics, so if I'm wrong, please do correct me. But my understanding is that one of the major things that where the two countries diverged in terms of their economic development was land reform. So South Korea, I won't talk about this because I'll be focusing on democratization in the latter half, but in the 1950s, the South Korean government carried out a land reform policy to try to break up this landed aristocracy that had existed throughout the Joseon dynasty and the colonial era. And that was an important way to kind of break up this ruling class and provide for, it forced this ruling class to focus on industrialization rather than, economic or agricultural empire, so to say. And this was a very important move in giving the South Korean people, the peasants at that time, a way to make their own livelihoods. And it also forced this aristocracy class to begin focusing on industrialization. Whereas my understanding in the Philippines, this never took place. There was never a real major successful land reform policy that could break up this landed elite. And then in David Kang's book, Crony Capitalism, he kind of connects this to the way that the governments functioned in the 1960s and 70s. In South Korea, particularly under Park Chung-hee, the promotion of government bureaucrats was more based on merit, right? He was putting into people those with technocratic expertise to contribute to economic development. Whereas in the Philippines, there was more of this old system of patronage, where government positions were more likely to be given to people based on political reasons, right? Who do you need to satisfy amongst this landed elite to keep them in your political camp? And so those people were more interested in making money for themselves through corrupt practices rather than developing the economy. If you want to talk about, where can the Philippines go from here? And this is where I have to plead a little bit of ignorance about Filipino politics, but land reform and dealing with corruption in the government bureaucracy are, at least from my understanding of the comparison of the two countries during the Cold Wars, are two things that South Korea did, whereas the Philippines did not. Again, please, if those have been addressed by Filipino politics, I'm very excited to hear about what has been done more recently in the Philippines. But if we're talking about the Cold War, when South Korea started to develop very quickly, whereas the Philippines developed more slowly, I think those were the two major factors in my understanding. Somebody's got their hand up, it looks like.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Engel. I think Korea has the same experience with Japan when there was a real land reform that happened that divided all these zaibatsu, which was unfortunately to this day this is still a struggle among the farmers and the peasants of the country. Okay, so we have another question from our students. So would you please just mention your name and your major, and then please give your question.
Good morning, Professor Engel. I am Christian Chua from UP Diliman, a journalism student. So for today's session, I am interested to know what are the present attitudes or perceptions of North Koreans regarding unifications. Is there any divide between the attitudes of North Koreans and the elites regarding this issue? That's all po.
Do you mean like amongst the people in North Korea and South Korea, or do you mean the governments?
The people in North Korea.
Okay, yeah, very good question. Of course, this is a hard question to answer because we can't go to North Korea and do public opinion surveys, right? We're not allowed to do that type of stuff. But what one group in South Korea here does, it's called the Institute of Peace and Unification Studies here at Seoul National University. They conduct public opinion surveys of recent defectors. So people who have come to South Korea within the last year or two. And when they survey recent North Korean defectors, they find that North Koreans are very anxious to unify the Korean Peninsula. However, if you look at South Korean public opinion surveys, especially amongst the younger generation, so people your age, there is almost not, I wouldn't say no interest in unification, but it's not something they think is an important task. South Koreans, especially younger South Koreans, are more focused on their own issues, economic issues, the lack of jobs, the expensive housing, low wages, these types of things. And the idea of unification with North Korea, they think is going to be so expensive for South Korea, right? North Korea is so underdeveloped that if the two countries are to unify now, the South Korean government have to spend so much money to invest in North Korea, improve its infrastructure, start to provide for these people who are incredibly poor, malnourished. And we have the precedent of East-West German unification, right? And there's studies out there that show that West Germany had to, spend all this money to bring East Germany up to par, and it's still an ongoing process. But at least East Germany was somewhat developed when they unified. North Korea is basically a country stuck in the 1950s, 1960s. So the cost for South Korea would be just, exponential compared to what it was for West Germany. So North Koreans, I would say on the whole, yes, unification is very important. South Korea, less important, especially amongst the younger generations. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. I think we have another question from our student. Alicia Luis Navarro, are you there? Okay, there.
Good morning. I am Elisha, third-year student from Public Ad. I'm just curious if when mass mobilization was perceived as unsuccessful because of the lack of incentives to effectively improve the economy, was the further military building was one of its ways to make up for this economic drawback?
I don't know if the North Korean government has ever officially decided that it's not going to be effective, because in many ways they still urge the North Korean people to go through. And on one of my slides, when I was talking about mass mobilization, let me see if I can throw this up here again real quick. I mentioned that so I mentioned, I didn't talk about it, but there's a mass movement activity called the Cholima movement. Cholima is this mythical horse that could run thousands of miles in a single day. And the North Korean government built a statue for this movement called the Cholima movement. And it's still something that's, if you read North Korean press and whatnot, they still talk about this to this day. So officially, the North Korean government still pushes for these mass mobilization campaigns. Quietly, however, and this is something that's really happened since the famine in the 1990s. Now we have these so-called private markets in North Korea. In Korean, they're called the jamadang. So there is this kind of black market, capitalist black market that exists in North Korea. That is, I mean, it's a capitalist system, right? It's based on incentives, right? The more you trade, the more things you bring into North Korea, the harder you work, so to say, the richer you can become. So there is a kind of, especially the younger generation in North Korea living along the Chinese border, have already, through practice, definitely not through indoctrination, but through practice, learned about capitalism, how it works. how, if you work harder, if you work smarter, you can earn more money than other people. But this is something that the North Korean regime itself will never talk about openly, right? And there was a period in the early 2009, 2010, where the North Korean government tried to get this black markets under control through currency reform, but there was so much anger amongst the North Korean people that they had to reverse their position. They weren't able to carry out this currency reform to suppress the Jamadangs. Officially, mass movements are still a thing, but they don't work anymore. The people don't buy into it. And if those who have access to, especially China, engage in trade quietly by themselves to make a living. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions. I think at this point we have to let Dr. Engel go on a break. And then so it's currently 10:37. So shall we at 10:37 here in the Philippines in Manila? Yep. So it's like 10 minutes. So we will see you at 10:47. Will that be fine?
Okay. Okay. See everybody soon.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so we are back. And at this point, before Dr. Engel continue his lecture, I would just like to acknowledge his heroic way of condensing for us this morning's lecture. Uh, in the first part, he showed us the hand of imperialism closely at work on how these superpowers, the US and Soviet Union, compete like they are playing a game of chess with the North and South Korea as their pawns. I see a lot of parallelism between Korean and Philippine historical experience under the American rule and even after World War II and the Japanese occupation. How there was a division of loyalties among the locals, like the pro-Japanese and the pro-Americans, the division of loyalties among the North Koreans mentioned in the lecture, and even reflecting on the protracted people's war waged by armed forces of the outlawed Philippine left against the Philippine government, which has pro-American policies. It is unfortunate that these superpowers never really listened to what the colonized states want for themselves. Instead, they just come to conclusion that the locals are not ready to rule themselves. In the first part of this lecture, Dr. Engel showed us that these superpowers, including China, use the divide and rule policy to protect their own interests and not that of the Korean people. So we are now ready to listen to the second part of the lecture. We give you back, Dr. Engel.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's a perfect segue into what I want to talk about now with a brief history of South Korean democratization. And we're going to get more of, in this case, the U.S. Intervention or lack thereof in South Korea when it came to preserving or building democracy in South Korea during the Cold War era. So during this second half of the lecture, I'm going to be focusing on South Korea's democratization process based on these two questions. The first, why did South Korea only succeed in democratization in 1987, despite, as we'll see, a movement that was ongoing throughout South Korean history following its foundation in 1948. And then as I go through this history, I'll also be talking a little bit about why the United States did not intervene against South Korea's military rulers. Here in the pictures on this slide, you can see two U.S. presidents, Jimmy Carter in the black and white photo alongside Park Chung-hee. And then in the picture that's in color, you see President Ronald Reagan having a toast with Chun Doo-hwan, South Korea's last military dictator. So despite maybe some behind the scenes moving by the United States, we can see very publicly support for these military rulers here in these very symbolic pictures. So why did the United States at least offer this sort of public support for military rule in South Korea? Before getting started, I want to take a step back and give a little bit of a bird's eye view of South Korea's 6 so-called republics. So you can kind of see that South Korea has gone through a lot of ups and downs since it has so many republics. And in each case, this is signifying a major restructuring of South Korea's constitution. And so the first republic from 1948, South Korea's establishment, until 1960 was the Seungman-rhee or Lee Seung-man era in South Korea. Although Seungman-rhee was not a military officer, he was not a military dictator, he did have many authoritarian aspects to his rule that we'll be talking about, but he was brought down by the so-called April Revolution of 1960. And after he resigned from office, it started the short Second Republic that was an interesting interlude in South Korea's history, because the Second Republic was South Korea's only real experiment with parliamentary style government, so something more similar to parliamentary systems we have in many Western European countries, rather than the presidential system that South Korea has mainly had, that's more close to the American system. However, this Second Republic was interrupted on May 16th, 1961, when Park Chung-hee carried out his military coup. And for about 2 years, there was a status of no republic, right? You can see that there's a gap in between the Second and Third Republic. That was when Park Chung-hee ruled literally as a military dictator at the head of a military junta. However, he was pressured at this point by the United States to retire from the military and put in place a new constitution and run for presidential elections as a civilian, which he did. And this is the Third Republic era that is somewhat democratic during Park Chung-hee's rule. In 1972, in October 1972, Park Chung-hee carries out what you can call a self-coup, similar to what Marcos did. Actually, their self-coups were right next to each other. Park Chung-hee's came just 2 weeks, I believe, after Marcos declared martial law in the Philippines. And this instigated the Fourth Republic, or what some people call the Winter Republic here in South Korea, because of its very in-your-face authoritarian style of government. Park Chung-hee was assassinated on October 26, 1979. And although there was a short period known as the Seoul Spring, in which it looked like South Korea might democratize at that point, this short-lived hope was diminished on December 12, 1979, when Chun Doo-hwan began his process of claiming power through claiming power first in the military and then repressing the democratic movement at that time through the Gwangju Democracy Movement, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And Chun Doo-hwan ruled South Korea from officially as president from 1980 to 1987, when the June democracy movement of 1987 brought an end to the Chun Doo-hwan era. And now in South Korea, we live in the so-called Sixth Republic, which is the current democratic era. And we've had, to this point, 7 peaceful transfers of power between 2 major political parties. I won't get into the Sixth Republic, and I'm going to focus on these different democratic transition periods, the first 2 being failures, because we have the emergence of authoritarian leaders afterwards, and then the final successful democratic transition or juncture in 1987. So we'll start with the First Republic, which was, as I mentioned, founded upon the Republic of Korea's foundation. The first constitution provided for a unicameral National Assembly, or parliament. Here in South Korea, we call it the National Assembly. And this National Assembly was chosen by the people. I have it in quotes there because the first election was quite limited in terms of who could vote. But nevertheless, for the most part, afterwards, suffrage was universal in South Korea. And initially, under this first constitution, the president was chosen by the National Assembly. However, the constitution was amended, and I have that in quotes as well, in 1952. The constitution was amended to allow for the president to be directly elected by the people, and the vice president as well was directly elected by the people as well. So this was an interesting situation, which I believe, I'm not sure if the Philippines still has it. I know it was a part of your political system for a while, where the president was elected, the vice president was elected separately, which is different from the US system, for example, where the president and vice president run together on the same ticket and both are chosen. So you had the potential for a divided government with the president from one party and the vice president from another party. But the reason I have amended here in quotations is because the Constitution was not amended at this point through a democratic process. In the midst of the Korean War, the government of South Korea moved to Busan, right? So as I mentioned, over the course of the war, North Korea invasion pushed South Korea only to this bubble only around Busan. So the government was forced to move all its operations to Busan during this time. And in the course of the war, something called the Busan Incident happened in 1952. Lee Seung-man during this period had become quite unpopular amongst the other South Korean political elite. And if there was going to be a second election in 1952, he was going to lose. He was not popular amongst the members of the National Assembly, and he recognized that he was going to lose this election. But he thought, as a wartime president, if the Constitution was amended so that the people selected the president, he would have a better chance of being reelected. So what he did in 1952 to force the National Assembly to amend the Constitution was he orchestrated the arrest of several members of the National Assembly under the charges of supporting communism. And this forced many of the members of the National Assembly to vote in favor of the amendment to the Constitution. Even in this case, the amendment officially did not pass by one vote. However, using some tricky math, it argued that in terms of percentage-wise, the amendment had been passed, and so the president of South Korea from this point was argued to be, you have to have a public election for the people to choose, and that's what happened in 1952. Seung-man Rhee was elected via this direct election to his second term in office. During this period, not only during the Busan incident of 1952, but also later on in 1953, when Lee Seung-man was being he was opposing the signing of the armistice agreement with North Korea, the U.S. made plans to actually remove Lee Seung-man via a military coup. And at one point, the leader of the South Korean army was in the United States, and the United States was kind of feeling him out and planning this military coup to put this military leader, Lee Seung-yup, forget his name, sorry about that, into power. However, the United States eventually decided not to do this. They weren't sure that the person that they would replace Lee Seung-man with was going to be any more of a Democrat than Lee Seung-man. So the U.S. balked and did not put this plan into motion. And then in 1954, Lee Seung-man had to have the Constitution amended again because the initial Constitution had term limits. The president could only serve 2 terms. So Lee Seung-man had to again bully the National Assembly into adopting another amendment to allow him to run for a 3rd term. And in 1956, Lee Seung-man or Seung-man Rhee's popularity amongst the people was starting to decline at this point. He was being viewed as more of an authoritarian. His government was not achieving any sort of real economic growth. And as a result, there was debates and a lot of people predicting that Lee Seung-man would lose this 1956 election. But to Lee's fortune, actually, his opponent in the election died about a week before the election was held. He was very old. But even with his opponent dead, Lee Seung-man still only managed to win 56% of the vote, really showing how unpopular he was at the time. And during this period, we also, in this election, the opposition candidate wins the vice presidency, showing yet again how unpopular Seung-man Rhee was. With the term limits abolished, Lee Seung-man decided to run for a 4th term in 1960, and this ended up being the downfall of the Seung-man Rhee era. Lee Seung-man by 1960 is even more unpopular. There's massive, movement to ensure that he does not win this 4th election, and to make sure that he wins the election. The Lee Seung-man government engages in a lot of trickery, right? They buy votes. They use the police and military to pressure citizens into voting for Seung-man Rhee within the military, which is massive, right? At this point, the war has only been over for about 7 years at this point. There are still, hundreds of thousands of men serving in the South Korean military. Through the military command structure, they pressure, rank and file soldiers to vote for Seung-man Rhee. And when the results of the 1960 election are announced, Lee Seung-man has been reelected. And the people just can't believe this, right? There is no way, you're talking with people around you. Nobody likes this guy. How could this possibly have happened? We know about the pressure. We know about the suspicion. People suspect massive vote rigging, and protests rise up against the 1960 election. People are demanding a new election be held, and the police are called out to repress these democratic elections at this point that are going on throughout the country. And amidst these protests in March of 1960, the police in Masan, which is a city just to the west of Busan, so down on the far southern end of the Korean Peninsula, the police fire into the protest crowds of protesters. And at this point, one high school student, a boy named Kim Ju-yeol, was struck in the head by a tear gas canister, and he died. The police, to cover up this incident, they throw his body into the ocean, just off the coast from the city of Masan. However, weeks later, his body floats to the surface and is discovered by fishermen near the city. When they recover his body, bring it ashore, it's very clear that the cause for his death was having been struck in the head by a tear gas canister. And this leads to the eruption of more democracy protests in April of 1960. And this is what we today call the April Revolution here in South Korea. The protests are extremely massive. It's led by university students in particular, which is a very important feature of the democracy protests throughout South Korean history. University students in Seoul march to the Blue House. The Blue House is what in English we call the president's residence. In Korean, it's known as Cheongwade. If you follow recent Korean politics, you may have heard that the current president, Yoon Suk-yeol, decided to move the president's residence out of Cheongwade, or the Blue House, and today the Blue House is a tourist attraction. So if anybody's coming to South Korea in the near future, you can actually go visit the Blue House now as a tourist. In any case, the university students protesting Seungmanri marched on the Blue House, and there the police opened fire again and killed hundreds of democracy protests. Among them were 8 Seoul National University students. So this picture down here is actually a monument that we have on our campus here. And in every April, there's a ceremony held to commemorate those who were killed and injured in the April Revolution. With the massive protests that were happening, the United States went to Lee Seung-man and kind of pressured him to resign. You're no longer really able to command the respect and popularity amongst the Korean people. It would be better for everybody if you just leave. And so Lee Seung-man eventually decides to resign, and he goes into exile in Hawaii, actually, where he dies a few years later. So we have this question at this point, is that the U.S. did sort of intervene in 1960 by pressuring Seungmanri to resign. However, throughout the 1950s, the U.S. had firsthand experience with Seungmanri's authoritarian tendencies. He was a thorn in their side in many respects, especially during the armistice talks, where Lee Seung-man was refusing to abide by the armistice unless the United States agreed to sign a mutual defense treaty with South Korea, which it did shortly after the armistice agreement was signed. So in the fall of 1953 is when the United States and South Korea signed their mutual defense treaty that is still in place till this day, as we all know. So why did this intervention come in 1960? It was very easy at that point, right, for the United States to intervene. It was very clear that this wouldn't be a U.S.-led coup d'etat. It was the people's will that Lee Seung-man leave office, and the United States only had to play the role of facilitator rather than being the entity that was directly intervening. it was also becoming at this point, which is really the key theme, if you will, of the reasons that the United States doesn't intervene throughout this period, is that the United States is more concerned about security and stability on the Korean Peninsula. However, when democracy protests boil to the point, as they did in April 1960, that South Korea seems like it's on the brink of civil war with itself, right? Not civil war between North and South Korea, but a South-South civil war, is when the United States becomes more interested in intervention, because that will kind of work together well with the U.S. main interest of maintaining peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. It's feared that if South Korea goes into a civil war with itself, that would be an opportunity for Kim Il-sung and North Korea to invade again. So only when security on the Korean Peninsula is threatened does the United States actually intervene. And our first example of that is with this April Revolution of 1960. So with Lee gone, as I mentioned before, we have the establishment of the Second Republic and this attempt to put in place a parliamentary style government with the prime minister holding, real power. The position of president still existed, but this was more of a figurehead type of position. So maybe you think of something like Germany, where, you have both a prime minister and a president, but the real power resides in the prime minister, and the president is more of a figurehead, does some sort of ceremonial duties, but doesn't have any actual policy-making power. That's the situation we have in the Second Republic. However, the Second Republic is, really weak because it is still trying to overcome the political problems that were present during the Lee era. The people want, justice, served to the people in the Lee government who were complicit in helping him maintain power for all those years. They want to see the national police really emasculated of power, because the police had been a primary instrument of authoritarian politics. They had been the people who were firing into crowds and killing democracy protesters. So there's a lot of battles within the government about how to reform the police. And during this period, we also continue to have high inflation and high employment in South Korea. And it's at this point where Park Chung-hee emerges onto the scene with his coup d'etat on May 16th, 1961. If you read different biographies about Park Chung-hee, we come to know that he was actually planning a coup d'etat against Seungman Rhee, but this plan was interrupted because of the April Revolution. So Park Chung-hee put his plans for a coup d'etat kind of in the back pocket to see what would happen with this Second Republic. But after about a year of watching the political parties unable to really address South Korea's problems, Park Chung-hee takes it upon himself to grab power and asserts that the military is the most competent body to initiate the kind of reforms that South Korea needs to rise up, to develop economically, to build a strong military, to ensure that a North Korean invasion never happens again. Park Chung-hee is very nationalistic in the sense that he has, goals of, trying to at least weaken the amount of influence that the United States has in the country. Park Chung-hee was born during the Japanese colonial era, and he was educated at the Manchurian Military Academy in Manchuria, Manchukuo. He also attended the Japanese Military Academy in Tokyo. He was a admirer of the Meiji Restoration in Japan, and thought it was very important for a strong government to put in place the reforms necessary to make South Korea a rich country with a strong military. So he adopted a lot of the language and mottos of Meiji Japan, and wanted to see South Korea kind of follow in the footsteps of Japan. He was a collaborationist, I guess you could say, in the sense that he worked for the Japanese colonial authorities, but he wasn't, trying to ensure that South Korea again came under the thumb of Japan. He wanted to see his country become an equal of Japan, right? And a country that could not be colonized by anybody in the future. But his methods for taking South Korea to this point were very authoritarian. So after Park Chung-hee's military coup, as I mentioned before, he ruled the country as the head of the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction. This was the official name of the military junta that ruled South Korea from May 1961 until the end of 1963. However, the U.S. Government isn't necessarily opposed to Park Chung-hee ruling the country, and in some ways, appreciates his long-term goals. But as the leader of the so-called free world, the Kennedy administration, which was, in power at the time in the United States, didn't want to have its allies ruling through expressed military dictatorship, right? We are the free world. We are the democratic world. We have to at least have this facade of democracy around us to show that we have the support of the people. So the United States was very active in pressuring Park Chung-hee not to necessarily step down from power, but to put up, again, this facade of democracy by retiring from the military first, calling for what they hoped would be, relatively free and open elections. And Park Chung-hee, despite initially not wanting to do this, and at one point, trying to overturn his original promise to do so, decides that he cannot really oppose the United States on this issue at the time. South Korea requires U.S. Military and economic assistance to, function as a country. And so Park Chung-hee agrees eventually to put forth a new constitution, a democratic constitution that was in many ways pretty similar to the constitution of the First Republic. Again, we have a unicameral National Assembly. The president is directly elected by the people. And in December 1963, Park Chung-hee wins his first election against a man named Yoon Bo-sun, who was actually the president during the Second Republic, but was in that weakened presidential role, so he didn't have any actual power. And he wins re-election again in 1967 against Yoon Bo-sun as well. And then Park Chung-hee wins a third election, again after having to amend the constitution. So we can see many aspects of Park Chung-hee's authoritarianism in this so-called, if there is a democratic era to his rule, it is this period in the 1960s, between 1963 and 1972. But nevertheless, we can see behind the facade here in many different instances. One of those instances is in 1964, Park Chung-hee makes the decision to normalize relations with Japan. Once South Korea was liberated from Japanese colonial rule in 1945, the country, South Korea and Japan, didn't have a formal relationship with one another. Any trade that took place was, black market in nature. Neither country had an embassy in the other country's capitals. There was no formal ties between the two, which was very distressing to the United States, right? The United States has this so-called hub and spokes system of alliances in the Pacific as part of its containment strategy towards the Soviet Union and Communist China. And so for these different hubs in this alliance structure, not to be talking with each other, not to be cooperating, was very worrying to the United States government, especially with, Japan serving as this important, kind of rear staging ground for any military action that would have to take place on the Korean Peninsula. During the Korean War, right, U.S. bombers and planes are flying over from Japan to attack North Korea. All of the U.S. logistical, supply lines run from the United States through Japan into Korea. Japanese industry is revitalized by the Korean War by providing a lot of materials that the U.S. military and South Korean military needed to fight the war. So with Japan and South Korea not really speaking to one another, this was a very big issue. And the U.S. was always pushing Syngman Rhee to normalize relations with Japan, but given his strong anti-Japanese sentiment, this was nearly impossible. But with Park Chung-hee, it's a different story, right? He is a former Japanese collaborator. He admires Japan to a certain degree, and he's more pragmatic in the sense that he recognized that Japanese assistance can be useful in modernizing South Korea. So Park Chung-hee is much more amenable to the U.S. Goal of seeing Japan and South Korea normalize their relationship. However, not everybody in South Korea is very excited about this, right? The memories of the colonial era are very fresh, right? Most of South Korean people at this time, at least adults, lived through the colonial era, right? They don't like Japan. They suffered at the hands of Japan. They don't want to see any Japanese influence returning to Korea. So there are large-scale protests that erupt in South Korea in 1964 to block the treaty to normalize relations with Japan. And Park Chung-hee uses martial law to quell these protests in 1964. And then the normalization of relations with Japan, the treaty is signed the next year in 1965. In 1969, we see Park Chung-hee use similar tactics to Lee Seung-man to force through the National Assembly an amendment to allow him to run for a third term as president. This Third Republic Constitution also had term limits. So Park Chung-hee, when he wanted to run for re-election in the 1971 election, he needed to amend the Constitution. His political party met secretly in the middle of the night without notifying the opposition party, and they, because they held a majority, passed the amendment to the Constitution in secret in the middle of the night. And then in 1971, Park Chung-hee, in his third presidential election, runs against a man named Kim Dae-jung, who I think many of you have probably heard about. He would go on to become the president of South Korea during the Sixth Republic from 1998 to 2003. In 1970s, he was a relatively young man in his 1940s. Kim Dae-jung was a very charismatic political figure. Park Chung-hee was not. He was more of a, he was very short. He was a kind of a dull person to listen to, like talk when you think about democracy and charismatic politicians. That was just not really what Park Chung-hee was. Kim Dae-jung was also running on a platform of trying to open up negotiations with North Korea to push forward with unification, or at least trying to set an atmosphere in which maybe divided families could meet one another. So these were very popular things to many people at the time, right? Maybe less so today because time has passed by. Not as many people are still alive that have family members in North Korea. But in the 1970s, this is still a very real, painful reality for many people living in both South Korea and North Korea. So Park Chung-hee is dealing with this very charismatic politician running on policies that might be more popular to many people compared to his very ardent anti-communist rhetoric. And so there are lots of corruption in the 1971 presidential election, vote buying operations that were based in part on bribes given to Park Chung-hee's political party by American oil companies. So a lot of dirty things happening during this election. And then on October 17th, 1972, actually, I think that date's wrong. It should be October 10th, 1972. Park Chung-hee declares martial law, and 10 days later proclaims the new authoritarian Yushin Constitution. And this is what we call the Winter Republic in South Korea. The Yushin Constitution, if there was a facade of democracy during the 1960s, this facade is now gone. The direct election of the president is abolished and is replaced with an electoral college, which is called the National Conference for Unification. The electors, the people in this National Conference for Unification, were officially selected by the people. So the people elected the electors who chose the president. But all of these electors were, tightly controlled by Park Chung-hee and his political party. So when this National Conference for Unification met for the first time to elect the president in 1972, after the Yushin Constitution is proclaimed, something like 99% select Park Chung-hee as the next president. So clearly, this is North Korea style democracy, right? The president also has the power under this UPCIS constitution to appoint 1/3 of the members of the National Assembly. So the National Assembly is now this rubber stamp type of institution. It has no real policy-making power. Whatever Park Chung-hee wants to be made law is going to be made law. The UPCIS constitution also officially allows for the civil rights of Korean people to be violated in cases of emergency. And the person, of course, responsible for declaring emergencies was the president, and he could declare or could pass emergency decrees without the approval of the National Assembly. So you just see this cycle, right? The National Assembly has no power to really check the president, and the president has the power to basically do what he wants. We don't really have enough time. If you are interested in the poem called The Winter Republic, I suggest you check it out online. It's very moving, in my opinion. This is only an excerpt of it. It's a little bit longer than this, but in any case, a very famous poem published in 1975, I believe, talking about how the sorry state of affairs in South Korea under the UPCIS regime. After Park Chung-hee declares martial law and institutes this UPCIS constitution, we very quickly see a resurgence of the Korean democracy movement that had kind of been dormant since the April Revolution, right? After the coup d'etat, Park Chung-hee comes to power. I'm not talking about it here, but very importantly, Park Chung-hee is beginning to push South Korea in the direction of economic development. The rate of growth in South Korea is beginning to climb quite a bit during the 1960s. So you have at least the facade of democracy. This guy, Park Chung-hee, used to be a military dictator, but he's at least making the economy better. So there, outside of the movement against normalizing relationship with Japan, there isn't a lot for a democracy. There isn't really a rationale for a democracy movement to exist for much of the 1970s, but the UPCIS constitution brings it back. And the first, actually, in many ways, if you look at this chart, you can see that there were a lot of protest events in 1970. This was a result of the corruption in the 1971 election. So I think you could say more accurately, the democracy movement was sparked by the corruption in the 1971 election, and then the UPCIS Constitution of 1972 continued to provide that rationale for democracy protests to continue. The first protests in 1973, in April, you have pastors in Protestant churches are passing out leaflets during meetings regarding Easter Sunday. And this signifies the emergence of the Christian clergy as another important aspect of the democracy movement in South Korea. And they would continue to be an important part of the movement throughout the 1970s and 1980s. In October of 1973, you have the first university student protest on the campus of Seoul National University. And in early 1974, Park Chung-hee uses his emergency decree powers for the first time to make protesting the UPCIS Constitution illegal. And his second emergency decree declared on the same day, if you are found to have violated the first emergency decree, you are allowed to be tried before a military tribunal, right? So you won't be tried before a civilian court. You will go before the military and be found guilty or innocent. And of course, this is a very easy way for Park Chung-hee to ensure that democracy activists are prosecuted very rigorously and receive very strict punishment. In some extreme cases, violators of these emergency decrees are jailed for very long times. Many of them are subjected to torture to extract these confessions, right? Anybody will confess to anything if you torture them enough. So torture became a very important part of repressing the democracy movement. In some extreme cases, democracy protesters were executed. One infamous example of this was student protesters in 1974. One of them was sentenced to execution, and he was executed alongside 7 people from the so-called People's Revolutionary Party. This People's Revolutionary Party was supposed to be a political party that was receiving support from North Korea to foment communist revolution in South Korea. But what it actually was a political plot orchestrated by the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, or KCIA. The KCIA was created by Park Chung-hee not long after he took power in 1961. On its face, right, its name suggests it's something like the American CIA that's involved in intelligence collection overseas. But in the Korea case, the Korean CIA was a CIA plus a sort of Gestapo secret police within South Korea that was tasked with monitoring democracy activists, arresting them, torturing them. In 1973, one of the first people they tortured was a professor from Seoul National University who, to escape his torture, actually committed suicide by jumping out of a window at a KCI building on Nam Mountain here in Seoul, South Korea. In any case, just a lot of brutality. This People's Revolutionary Party, this fabrication of the KCIA, they arrested 7 people who had some sort of loose leftist maybe ideas, and they were accused of having orchestrated this People's Revolutionary Party, and 7 of them were executed alongside one of the student protesters. And so the idea of this People's Revolutionary Party was to provide justification in the name of preventing the spread of communism by creating this faux organization. As the 1970s dragged on, particularly in 1975, you can see the number of protest events here peak in 1975, and then there's a sharp drop in 1976, right? The reason for this drop is in 1975, North Vietnam concludes its war against South Vietnam by taking over, right? It unifies Vietnam through war, despite, signing the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. The fall of Saigon happens in April 1975. And this is a very psychologically impactful event for South Korea, right? South Korea is also a divided country with a communist northern neighbor. So there's a lot of worry that this event in Vietnam is going to be replicated in Korea. So the protests quiet down quite a bit in 1976 and 1977. But as we get into 1979, a string of different protests, starting with something called the YH incident in August 1979, catalyzes a string of events that lead to large-scale democracy protests in Busan and Masan, down in southern Korea. And the Busan and Masan protests are very large-scale. Thousands of people in the streets rioting. They are overturning police cars, setting fire to police stations, setting fire to media like broadcasters, radio stations, because the media is seen as an arm of the Park Chung-hee government. And to repress these large-scale protests in 1979, Park Chung-hee again declares martial law in Busan, calls out the military, arrests hundreds of democracy protests. And although the protests in Busan and Masan are put down by the military, about a week later, the Busan and Masan protests took place from October 16th to October 20th. About a week later, Kim Jae-gyu, who was the director of the KCIA, assassinated Park Chung-hee on October 26, 1979, allegedly to bring democracy to Korea. If you look through all the details of Kim Jae-gyu's assassination of Park Chung-hee, you could see that within Park Chung-hee's inner circle, there was a debate emerging about whether he should be using the military to maintain power. Kim Jae-gyu was on this moderate side that argued that, no, we shouldn't be, repressing these democracy activists through the use of military power. That is doing the same thing that Lee Seung-man did in 1960, right? when we were planning this revolution, this coup d'etat, Park Chung-hee called his coup d'etat a revolution. That's why I used that word. When Park Chung-hee was planning his coup d'etat, one of his reasons was to bring sanity to the South Korean government, right? To focus on reforms, make the country strong, improve the lives of the people. But what are we doing now? We're doing the same thing that Syngman Rhee was doing. On the other side of this argument was a very hardline figure named Cha Ji-chul, who was the director of the Presidential Security Service, which is kind of like the Korean Secret Service, right? The people tasked with protecting the president. And he argued that, no, we have every right to, repress. Nobody can lead this country but us. And during a dinner meeting at which Kim Jae-gyu and Cha Ji-chul and Park Chung-hee, they were sitting down having dinner at a kind of safe house near the Blue House on October 26th. Cha Ji-chul originally allegedly made a remark to the effect that in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge are killing 2 million, 3 million people, and the United States isn't doing anything about it. Who's going to blink an eye if we kill 1 million people in South Korea to maintain our power? And it was allegedly this statement that Kim Jae-gyu found so irreprehensible, and Park Chung-hee allegedly voiced support for what Cha Ji-chul was saying about, killing hundreds of thousands of people. Kim Jae-gyu alleges that he shot Park Chung-hee to prevent something like that from happening. Of course, we're not sure we can take Kim Jae-gyu's words at this, right? You have to remember he's the director of the KCIA, the organization that was responsible for arresting and torturing people. So this guy wasn't exactly a Democrat himself. In any case, this was the end of Park Chung-hee and the Yushin regime. So we have these large democracy protests, especially in 1979, that take place. We have Park Chung-hee's death via assassination. And after Park Chung-hee was assassinated, as I mentioned at the opening, there was a short period of political easing in late 1979 and early 1980 that we call the Seoul Spring, when Park Chung-hee's successor, a man named Choi Kyu-hya, who was the prime minister under Park Chung-hee, and he became the acting president after Park Chung-hee's death. Her kind of, in some ways, his own, ideas about how to rule the country, and also the United States is behind him, urging him to make some, go through some political liberalization. What happens is that a new military dictator emerges, and that man is Chun Doo-hwan. Chun Doo-hwan was the leader of a group of military officers who had formed a kind of secret society within the military called Hamilhwae. Many of these officers were angry that an older generation of military officers was not retiring and thus blocking their promotion opportunities. So Chun Doo-hwan uses this anger amongst some in the officer corps to plot a sort of coup d'etat on December 12, 1979. It's not a coup d'etat in the sense of Park Chung-hee's coup d'etat, in that Chun Doo-hwan did not outright grab full political power at this time. What he did was to remove the senior leaders of the military and take power within the military. However, over the course of early 1980, Chun Doo-hwan slowly begins to accrue more power to himself. And an important point was in April 1980, Chun Doo-hwan appoints himself as the director of the KCIA, which was an important symbol that he was, interested in grabbing political power for himself. And that move to become the director of the KCIA is what instigates a wide-scale democracy protests that wrapped up with the Gwangju democracy movement in May 1980. With these large-scale democracy protests happening throughout the country, Chun Doo-hwan declares martial law at midnight on May 18th. And the military is deployed throughout the country, particularly on college campuses, to make sure that democracy protests don't go any further. However, in Gwangju, the deployment of the military did not silence the university students, and they continued to protest on the day of May 18th. And the military attacked the university student protesters on that day. And as the people of Gwangju, the average citizens saw the repression of the military, more and more common citizens, you could say, joined the democracy protests, which invited greater levels of repression by the South Korean military. And this cycle of escalation between the larger protests and larger military violence culminated a few days later when the South Korean military fired into a crowd of democracy protests in Gwangju. These protesters then broke into an armory and armed themselves and fought back, in the streets of Gwangju against the South Korean military. So in a way, kind of an open. This is what the South Korean government called it: an open rebellion by the city of Gwangju against the government in Seoul. The military was driven out of the city, and for a few days, negotiations ensued to try to find a peaceful conclusion to this kind of standoff between the military and democracy protesters in Gwangju. However, these negotiations failed, and in the early morning hours of May 27th, the military re-entered the city and killed the few remaining kind of hardliner democracy protesters who weren't willing to lay down their arms. And the repression of the Gwangju democracy movement was kind of what sealed Chun Doo-hwan's hold on power. Oh, sorry, I should have put this slide up there while I was describing the Gwangju democracy movement. I apologize. The American role in the repression of the Gwangju democracy movement became, and still is in many ways today, a huge issue in South Korea-US relations. When the repression of the Gwangju democracy movement began, the United States found itself with two conflicting goals. I wouldn't say that the United States was not interested in holding up human rights and democracy as important values for South Korean society, but it also, as I mentioned before, had to ensure that a North Korean invasion did not happen as a result of South-South conflict or South versus South civil war. So what the United States decided to do at this point was to support the military and Chun Doo-hwan in restoring order in Gwangju. And then it said, after order is restored, we will again take up the cause of pushing the South Korean military towards political liberalization. So for many people in South Korea, what this looked like was that the U.S. was, taking the side of a military dictator and condoning the use of violence against democracy protesters. And many people, especially in Gwangju, have really never forgiven the United States for what it did at this time. After democratization succeeded in 1987, there was a good 15-year period, even before democratization, beginning really right after the Gwangju democracy movement up until the early 2000s. There was a lot of anti-American sentiment in South Korea that was born of America's non-intervention during the Gwangju democracy movement. So with Chun Doo-hwan taking power via the repression of the Gwangju democracy movement, he, after becoming president officially in August 1980, instituted the Fifth Republic, which is really the Yushin system with a new name. There was very little different about the way that government was structured. Chun Doo-hwan was not elected via a direct presidential election. He was chosen by, again, this sort of corrupt electoral college. And after the brutal repression by this new military government in 1980, South Korean society kind of went into a quiet period. They were in a way kind of scared of protesting, and rightfully so. Although the media did not officially report what had happened in Gwangju, of course, word of mouth spread. People with access to foreign media outlets learned about what had happened in Gwangju because the foreign media, if you've seen the movie Taxi Driver, you know that the foreign media reported on what was happening in Gwangju. But underneath the surface, underneath this quiet surface, the Korean people had really turned against military rule. And this was not really demonstrated clearly until the 1985 National Assembly elections. So the National Assembly, was, emasculated, but there were still elections to be held. And in 1985, the opposition party, led by Kim Yong-sam, who was an important figure during this period as well, actually received more votes in total than the ruling military dictator's party. So this showed that even though if the Korean people weren't saying so out loud, that there was immense support for the opposition party, for democratization. And once it became known that there was this, grassroots support for democratization, more active democracy activism began in 1986. And something quite unique happened at this point. We had, for the most part, these groups who played an important role in democratization already engaging in democracy activism, but they began to finally coordinate their activities. So students, laborers, the religious groups, the Christians I mentioned before, the opposition party began to form kind of these formed an umbrella organization that would coordinate their different political activism, student protests, statements by religious leaders. With this kind of synergy effect, they really began to push Chun Doo-hwan and the military government very hard for reform. And before I get to that, I want to also mention that Chun Doo-hwan made what might be kind of called a strategic mistake when he came to power. He promised when he became president in 1980 that he would serve a single 7-year term. So from 1980, there was a kind of deadline of 1987 as this important year in which Chun Doo-hwan said, I'm serving one term and I will step down. So everybody knew in 1985, 1986, 1987 that the deadline was coming and there was going to be this kind of point of climax. And with that kind of deadline set, the democracy movement had a date to point to, right? Chun Doo-hwan is going to step down, and from that moment, we are going to see democratic reforms. However, of course, Chun Doo-hwan doesn't want to give up power. He, in a sense, recognizes that he can't be president any longer after 1987, but the plan becomes to replace Chun Doo-hwan with a close friend of Chun Doo-hwan's, with a man named No Tae-woo. No Tae-woo had been at Chun Doo-hwan's side ever since his first kind of coup within the military in December 1979. Chun Doo-hwan was going to try to pass political power, this authoritarian power, to No Tae-woo in 1987. However, before they get to that point, the kind of last straw emerges. In January 1987, a Seoul National University student named Park Jung-chul is tortured to death by the KCIA for his participation in the democracy movement. If you're interested, somebody asked last time about movies, and I can list a couple more later on. I already mentioned The Taxi Driver. There's a movie called 1987, When the Day Comes, I think is its English title, that displays the events of 1987 in fairly good detail. So if you're interested in movie representations of it, definitely check that out. Park Jung-chul is tortured to death. The Catholic Priests Association, with the help of different people along the way, is able to reveal on May 18th, a very symbolic day, right? This is the day of the Gwangju democracy movement, that Park Jung-chul had been tortured to death. Originally, the military government had said that he died from a heart attack during his interrogation, which was a ridiculous claim, right? This is a young college student. Nobody dies from a heart attack at the age of 20 or 21. And so after this revelation on May 18th, huge protests erupt throughout the country. And during one of those protests on the campus of Yonsei University here in Seoul on June 9th, 1987, a student named Lee Han-yeol was struck in the head by a tear gas canister. Now, this sounds familiar, right? The student named Kim Ju-yeol in Masan in 1960 was struck in the head by a tear gas canister. It's one of these things that, right, life is stranger than fiction. Who could have made up this kind of dramatic way for another student to be killed by being hit in the head by a tear gas canister by another authoritarian government? And days later, on June 18th, over 1 million South Koreans took to the streets to protest the attempt by Chun Doo-hwan to pass political power to No Tae-woo. And the government is unable at this time. The only way to put down protests this large was again to call out the military, to fire into crowds again. And at this point, 1987, the next year, Seoul is supposed to be hosting the Olympics. Supposed to be showing how it's a modern, rising country, and to have, the military shooting into crowds of protesters a year ahead of the Olympics would have just been a national disaster. In the age of TV, these deaths of protesters would have been, front page news all over the world. And what Chun Doo-hwan and No Tae-woo decide to do is to relent. And the June 29th declaration promises that a new constitution would be drafted, and the direct election of the president, which was a key demand of the democracy movement. The president would again be elected via direct election. In 1987, behind the scenes of these massive protests, you do have the Reagan administration quietly but fairly firmly urging Chun Doo-hwan to step down. And again, I mentioned this tactical mistake that Chun Doo-hwan said by stating that he would only serve a single term. And throughout the 1980s, the Reagan administration is constantly stating publicly that they look forward to political reforms in 1987 after Chun Doo-hwan steps down as president. In the midst of the large-scale protests in 1987, U.S. officials give public speeches urging restraint in South Korea. President Reagan sends a private letter to Chun Doo-hwan, also urging him to step down. And so, although I don't think we can say that this U.S. pressure was the key factor, we do have, again, quiet interference by the United States, as happened in May 1960. So to come back to the original two questions I gave there at the beginning, why did the movement finally succeed in 1987 where it had failed before? The first, I think, is that the military over time became less willing to intervene into politics. There was widespread understanding that if Chun Doo-hwan ordered the military in 1987 to fire on protesters, that most people in the military were going to ignore his orders. The Korean military had been ashamed by its role in the Gwangju democracy movement. One of the generals who was in charge of repressing the Gwangju democracy movement was said to have really regretted what he had done at that time, and he was also a close confidant of Chun Doo-hwan. So the military intervening was less likely to happen. But one of the main reasons the military was less likely to intervene was because the democracy movement by this time was so widespread that they were going to have to kill not just a couple hundred people, but probably thousands to be able to put down the movement at this time. The democracy movement was receiving society-wide support. It was now much better coordinated by this umbrella organization at the top. One key factor that many people point to is the support of the middle class in 1987 for the democracy movement. So if you look at, watch that movie or watch actual video from 1987, you can see office workers in Seoul, right? White collar people taking to the streets, throwing things out of windows. So there wasn't a social group that the Chun Doo-hwan regime could fall back on and say that they had the support of the people. And then I've already mentioned it several times, but why did the U.S. not intervene more forcefully over this time to protect democracy or to push for democratization in South Korea? It really was all about security on the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. was more concerned with the overall international picture, containing the spread of communism on all fronts. And Korea was an important battle line to ensure that communism didn't spread to Japan. Japan was the U.S. key ally in the Asia Pacific, and it was believed that if Korea fell to communism, then Japan might, through internal revolution or a communist invasion, fall to communism itself, and that was something that the United States was not willing to take a chance with. So Korea had to be that front line against communism in East Asia, and all other interests became subordinate to that overriding interest of containing communism, even the spread of democracy. So I had to rush through that a little bit quicker than I would have liked. So there might be some questions left. I know I didn't give a lot of time for questions. I apologize, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have about Korean democracy, democratization, authoritarianism, what be it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Engel. We have an anonymous participant with a question. Oh, but this has been asked already, right? Yeah, I think this has been asked about prospering like in South Korea. So this has been answered. Okay.
Looks like we have one question about Kim Jong-un's daughter.
Okay. So I have to, where is that? I don't see it. Oh. Rochelle Leonor, an MA student from UP. Since first year, we started seeing the daughter of Kim Jong-un accompanying him in some official functions. I'm curious on what some scholars or observers say about her appearances and whether this signals the start of building the daughter's own cult personality.
Yeah, this is a big debate in the North Korean watcher community these days, whether this is the beginning of North Korea's attempts to appoint a clear successor to Kim Jong-un. If we think about how Kim Jong-il in particular came to power after Kim Il-sung, there was a long apprentice period in which Kim Jong-il was given more power. Initially, he actually spent a lot of energy into the ideology and indoctrination. He was a big movie buff, and he was actually making a lot of propaganda movies for the North Korean government. But there was a long process of trying to establish Kim Jong-il as the clear successor to Kim Il-sung throughout the 1970s, 80s, and then that allowed him to smoothly take power in 1992, I believe, when Kim Il-sung finally passed away. On the other hand, when Kim Jong-un took power, it wasn't as clear that he was going to be the successor. He was quite kind of an unknown commodity, and people speculated a lot about Kim Jong-un as being maybe a potential reformer or something, because we just hadn't seen a lot of him before Kim Jong-il died. So this, putting his daughter forward is, some people take it as a sign that she will be the fourth in line in this so-called Kim dynasty. But there are other people who are very skeptical that a woman would be given this level of power within the North Korean government. This is to add to the speculation. We're not really sure. I think most people believe that Kim Jong-un has 3 children and that his oldest son is a son, and that Kim Ju-ye, who is the daughter that's being put forth, is his second child. I believe that's what the argument is. So that she is not the successor, but maybe a face to show the North Korean people a softer side of the regime, to try and build goodwill by putting forth a female personality, somebody who Kim Jong-un can show his love and affection to his daughter, being seen to kind of embrace the people through his embracing of his daughter. So yeah, we don't have a very clear answer to that. And there's other people that suspect that Kim Yo-jong, Kim Jong-un's sister, might actually be the person who would come to power if he were to die rather suddenly, quickly, before any of his children were really adults. So a lot of speculation. It's possible, and there are debates about it, but yeah, I can't really give a firm answer to that question, unfortunately. Do we have any other questions from the students in the classroom or elsewhere? Somebody's got their hand up. Ian? are you able to turn your camera and mic on? There you go.
Hello. Good morning. Yeah, thank you for the talk, Dr. Engel. I'm Ian. I'm an instructor in UP as well. And um, I'd just like to ask a question since you've been plugging books since your lecture. I'd also like to plug a book I've been reading. It's called Moral Politics in the Philippines, which sort of discusses the role of democracy or democratization in the Philippines. And there's this theory in like Asian countries in general. We have this shared history almost of authoritarian rule, resistance, and the role of the middle class in destabilizing these authoritarian structures. And one part of this book that I just like to ask if it's also happening in Korea is this role of the middle class in present day democracy, because there's this divide in society of like civil civil or civic spheres of the educated and the mass sphere, those who are uh, poverty situations, and how they sort of vie for control in the democratic process of the government, which is why we have sort of, for in the Philippines, for example, the recent elections of maybe um, educated people, middle class people voting for Leni Robredo, and the populist side of Marcos Jr. and the masses. And is this something that also manifests in Korea at the present day of? I'm sure that while you have a developed economy, there are recent discourses of inequality that present itself in like your articles, maybe Parasite, for example, Squid Game, and maybe do these discourses of do are there contestations between these two people, these two the middle class and the marginalized people vis-a-vis democracy in Korea nowadays, and yeah, how does it work? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question, and there definitely is the same tension between maybe, I guess I might phrase it as laborer class in South Korea versus the middle class. So if we look at the democracy movement, especially during the 1970s and 80s, one of the words you hear very often is minjum, which is kind of masses, is a way that you could translate that into English. And Namhee Lee has a great book on Minju ideology, if you're interested in that. And then in the 1980s, like I mentioned, the middle class was key in ensuring that democratization succeeded at that point by expressing their support for the democracy movement. And what's interesting about Korean democratization happening with the support of the middle class in the 1980s is that we get something that many Korean scholars call a conservative democratization. So democratization in Korea wasn't a revolution. It was a negotiated transition between the authoritarian military rulers, who were, of course, very conservative, in many ways representing the elite classes, these chaebol owners and whatnot, who have been in collusion with the military governments throughout the economic modernization process, with the opposition party, who were, elites in their own respect, given their levels of education and their own personal interests. So they negotiated a transition to democracy, which was very conservative in nature. So if you look at the political spectrum in democratic Korea today, it's somewhat skewed to the right. Of course, we have the Conservative Party, which is fairly rightist. The major progressive party, most people don't think of as very progressive. And so we have what one Korean political scientist has called the exclusion of the political left, especially the labor movement on the left, from party politics in South Korea. That was a result of this conservative democratization. The name of that scholar, if anybody's interested, is Che Jang-jip. He has a book called Democracy After Democratization that is written, was translated into English at some point. So that can give you some good ideas about how that process played out after democratization and led to the exclusion of the left and labor movement from current party politics in South Korea. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I don't see anyone with a question. So, wait, there is another one. Oh, this has been answered. Open one. Oh, just a thank you note.
Mhm.
Thank you, sir, for your engaging lecture. I would like to seek your thoughts on this. A question. Given that North Korea is currently in talks with Russia on selling arms and weaponry, what do you think would be the role of North Korea in case China will invade Taiwan to pursue unification? Do you think this will spill over in the Korean Peninsula?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was actually a huge topic during the Vietnam War. There was a lot of speculation that with the United States deeply embroiled in the war in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s, that North Korea might see that as an opportunity to reinvade South Korea to try and unify the Korean Peninsula at that time. There was actually a lot of North Korean provocations in 1967, 1968 that made people speculate that a North Korean invasion was imminent. Is it possible? I think many people would, of course, be thinking about the same sort of thing possibly taking place if China were to invade Taiwan, right? If a crisis opened up on the Korean Peninsula, this would prevent the U.S. forces stationed in Korea from being directed towards assisting Taiwan. This would force, the U.S. military bases that are in Japan, particularly its air bases, would have to divert their attention between helping in Taiwan and helping in Korea. So this would be advantageous, I guess you could say, to China because of that, with the United States having to divert its attention. However, it's the only way, I guess, today we have a North Korean military that's very backwards, to put it nicely. They have technology from the Cold War. Yes, they could use nuclear weapons against South Korea, but in terms of being able to actually successfully invade and occupy South Korea, that's not something that North Korea can really do. So if North Korea were to invade South Korea, they would have to be expecting the assistance of China again, and China would be busy invading Taiwan, right? So I don't think that China would be very excited about North Korea opening up a second front in this war, and possibly, if you're thinking about this strategically, that would open up a new flank, right, on China's east border up in Manchuria that the United States could possibly exploit, even though there would be great destruction in Korea because North Korea would be forced to use its nuclear weapons. There's no other real way for North Korea to deal with South Korea without using nuclear weapons. So I think North Korea might contemplate doing this on its own, but if it had to receive kind of Chinese permission or support for doing this, I'm not sure the Chinese would be willing to do that because it would just create more problems, as many problems for the Chinese as it would create for the Americans, I think. I hope that answers your question.
Okay. So I don't see any hands. Thank you again, Dr. Engel, for the second half of the lecture. The experience of South Korea's democratization process is something that we Filipinos, especially my generation, can somehow relate to. From the communist scare, vote buying and rigging, protests with police brutality, student leaders leading protests and even causing their deaths, very repressive government and heads of states. You mentioned about the parliamentary type of constitution, a short-lived one we had during the Marcos regime, although the president had the power and not the prime minister. And the post-Marcos regime coup d'etats during Corazon Aquino's administration, and head of state assuring the citizens there will be no extension of term, but Gloria Macapagal Arroyo ran for office again, and how war is an industry, even contributing to the industrialization of another country like Japan. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for actively participating in this morning's lecture. On behalf of the UP Center for International Studies and the GS197, the Making of Global Korea class of UPCIS, we would like to thank you, Dr. Engel, once again for the wealth of information you shared to all of us here in the Zoom and to our students in the classroom through this morning's lecture, Division of Korea and Post-War Korean History and Democratization. The second part of the Land of Turmoil, Colonization, and Division of the Korean Peninsula public lecture that the UP Korea Research Center organized, together with Seoul National University Asian Center and the Korea Foundation. But before we go, we must have the customary group photo. So can you please, those of you in the classroom, can you please come closer together so we can see you on the screen? And then can we have everyone turn on your cameras, please? Thank you.
Okay, so are you ready?
I think we are ready.
Okay. Okay, in 1, 2, 3. Okay, one more. 1, 2, 3. Okay, Ma'am Gina.
Okay, thank you so much. Let us give Dr. Engel another round of applause, please.
Thank you, everybody. It was a real pleasure to do this lecture, and I hope I can do it again in the future.
We will stay in touch, Dr. Engel.
Take care,
Hope we
everybody.
can invite you here next time.
That would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Care.
Take care, everyone. Have a nice day.
Too.